Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the Voice of Reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So, as of today, it is safe to say that Russian forces are conducting a general offensive against the Ukrainian military. After the defeat that took place within the vicinity of Avdiivka, the Russian military has gone on even more expansive offensive operations, both to the south of Avdiivka, but we're also seeing very large operations take place within the vicinity of Kupiansk and further south in the direction towards Lyman. Now, what we're also seeing, and this is very important, is the continued increase in Russian manufacturing capacity. It is estimated that Russian forces, or the Russian military-industrial complex, has been able to replace all of the 2023 losses of aircraft with new production aircraft produced in Russia. Now, this is namely Su-34s. The Su-34 fullback has taken the brunt of the losses, have taken most of the losses, due to the fact that it is used most widely. Now, we have seen other aircraft shot down reportedly in recent weeks, such as one or two Su-35s possibly. But again, Russia is continuing to produce those aircraft as well. The workhorse of the conflict in terms of aircraft continues to be that Su-34. Now, more and more reported uses of the Su-57 are also being reported. And Russia is estimated to have up to 20 to 22 of those Su-57s in operation against Ukrainian forces as we speak. And they're building more. We anticipate the final build out will be anywhere from 70 to 100 Su-57s once that production run finally ends, and could be even more expansive than that. Same goes with the Su-34. Again, at the start of the conflict, 100 to 20, 130, maybe 140 airframes were available for Russian forces. Obviously, the Russians have taken losses of those aircraft, but again, as I just mentioned before, they have been able to replace all of those airframes that have been lost. And they're producing more of the Su-34s. Now, the operations in the south, just south of Orikhiv, the Russians are continuing to press operations towards Robatna and collapse this bulge or pocket that was created during the failed summer offensive by Ukrainian forces. Now, we're seeing larger than expected Russian offensive operations against the Ukrainians as we enter deep winter and start to head into spring. We didn't anticipate we would see the large-scale operations that we are seeing now, and especially the operations that the Russians are preparing for in the future. So obviously there are very intensive, very large operations taking place in the areas that I just mentioned, such as obviously Avdiivka. The Russians continue offensive operations within the vicinity of Avdiivka. They've also redeployed some of those forces elsewhere as well. Obviously, there continues to be offensive operations down here towards Orikhiv and Zaporizhia, and then specifically up here towards the north, running from Kupiansk south towards the direction of Sloviansk and Liman. Now, the real question is, what is this going to look like in terms of Russian offensive operations when we reach the summer and late summer months? Conditions right now are very difficult for both sides. And when I say that, it is the weather. The weather has been unseasonably warm. There has been very, very harsh weather. If you are a infantry soldier, if you are on the front lines without shelter, it rains, it snows, it rains, it snows. The temperature drops, the temperature warms. The temperature drops, the temperature warms. It becomes very muddy, and then it freezes. Very difficult conditions. Yet the Russians are continuing these offensive operations in these very dire conditions. At the same time, Russian forces are continuing to build up additional capacity. Additional offensive capacity that will absolutely exceed the offensive operations that we're currently seeing now. We think this is probably going to culminate in very large-scale Russian offensive operations going into summer and late summer. We think the Russians are going to be even more prepared by that time. Now, one of the main challenges for the Ukrainian military as we speak is the supply of weapons and ammunition. Now, part of this is that the United States is not funding the war as it was prior. Now, it's just not a matter of funding the conflict. It is the matter of, can the United States outproduce the Russian state? And right now, the United States cannot outproduce Russia in terms of heavy artillery, 155, 152 millimeter in the case of the Russians. Most of the Russians' artillery is 152, 122, 130 millimeter. The Ukrainians are starting to use a lot more of the 155. At the onset of the conflict, obviously, they were using Soviet-era calibers such as the 152, just like the Russians. Now that has changed. The Ukrainians have lost a lot of that equipment. The new equipment that has come in is of the 155 millimeter howitzers that are being used. The United States has shipped a lot of 155 millimeter ammunition to the Ukrainians, as has the Europeans. A lot of these stockpiles are starting to thin out. That is why you saw the South Koreans send the United States their stockpile of 155 millimeter artillery rounds, because the United States then took its own stockpile of 155 millimeter artillery rounds and sent it to the Ukrainians. Now, I've addressed the reason why that occurred. The South Koreans did not want their production 155 millimeter artillery rounds being sent directly to the Ukrainians. There were end-user agreements where that artillery was simply sent directly to the United States. That would then backfill the large amounts of artillery being sent, or artillery ammunition being sent to the Ukrainians. Now, look, the Europeans are trying to ramp up production, but it's nowhere near what the Ukrainians need. Now, compounding that, there is another issue in terms of the supply of Ukrainians weapons and equipment, and specifically ammunition, to the front lines. And this is not what's being reported. The Ukrainians report very little information on Russian cruise missile and ballistic missile strikes. A lot of the ammunition that was sent to the Ukrainians, or has been sent to the Ukrainians, over the past several months has been interdicted by Russian missile strikes. So the Russians see where these stockpiles occur, and then they strike those stockpiles with long-range cruise missiles or long-range ballistic missiles. And that's kind of where we stand right now. Furthermore, the Russians reportedly received or have received in excess of an additional 400 precision-guided ballistic missiles from the Iranians within the last several weeks. We anticipate those weapon systems will be up, running, and targeting Ukrainian forces as well. Now there's the talk of the F-16. The F-16 that will eventually be turned over to the Ukrainians and used against Russian forces. Is that going to happen? At some point, possibly. But again, we're trying to analyze and dissect that if the Ukrainians receive the F-16, how are the Ukrainians going to operate the F-16? The minute the F-16 crosses into eastern Ukraine, and what I mean by that is areas east of the Dnieper River, or they get within 100 kilometers of Crimea, the Russians are going to be able to see those F-16s and engage those F-16s with their S-400s. So that'll be very interesting to see once that finally occurs. It will undoubtedly occur, and ultimately will we see air-to-air engagements between Russian MiG-31s, Russian Su-57s, Russian Su-30s, Russian Su-35s against these F-16s? Probably not. See long-range engagements by Russian MiG-31s against those F-16s, and we'll see long-range engagements by Russian S-400s, possibly even S-500s against those F-16s. But the idea that we will see dogfights or missile exchanges between Su-35s, Su-30s against AMRAAM-armed F-16s, I would say is pretty unlikely at this point. Again, these are going to be extreme, beyond visual range engagements. The Russians are going to keep their aircraft closer to Russia, try to pull in Ukrainian forces or Ukrainian aircraft, specifically the F-16s, try to get them to cross that point of no return, and then engage them within the air envelope of those S-400s and S-300s and different subsystems. So that's where we kind of set for today. Again, the Russian offensive continues, and we anticipate it is going to increase in tempo. And then finally, again, as we enter the late summer months, this conflict could start to change, and change rather dramatically. And that does not bode well for the Ukrainians. So more to come. As always, thanks for joining us. Have a great day.